She was born into the shadows, never destined for glory, never imagined to be remembered. Theodora, the daughter of a humble bear trainer, grew up not in golden palaces, but backstage in the gritty world of Constantinople's theaters. While other girls learned to sew and serve, she danced. She made the crowds laugh, cheer, and sometimes scoff. But behind that painted smile and graceful step, there was a storm of dreams too wild for the world she lived in. From an early age, Theodora knew that her life would not be simple. Her father's sudden death left the family in despair. Her mother, desperate to survive, took her and her sisters to the theater, hoping the stage would feed their bellies. There, among jesters and performers, Theodora learned not just to perform, but to survive. The spotlight became her armor, and applause, however faint, her only comfort. She danced. She mimed. She acted. And when the applause faded, she endured the silence of loneliness. The men who watched her didn't see a girl with dreams. They saw entertainment. And in time, Theodora had to sell more than just laughter to survive. She became part of a world where power came not from blood, but from beauty and cunning. But Theodora was no ordinary courtesan. She watched. She listened. She learned in the quiet corners of the palace, where mistresses whispered secrets and politics unfolded in between curtains. Theodora began to understand the real game of power. She knew that emperors didn't always wear crowns, and rulers weren't always seated on thrones. Sometimes, power lay in words, in eyes, in silence. And she mastered it all. But then came a journey, a trip that would change her forever. Tired of courtly games and empty promises, Theodora left Constantinople. She traveled eastward, to Alexandria, where a new world opened to her. In Egypt, she found faith. In the sands of a distant land, she found a mirror that reflected not her body, but her soul. She converted to Monophysite Christianity and began to dream of a life not just of survival, but of purpose. And fate was watching. Back in Constantinople, a young man named Justinian was rising, ambitious, brilliant, relentless. The heir to the empire, but a man not of noble blood. He too had climbed from the shadows. He too had felt the sting of mockery and the hunger of ambition. When Theodora returned to the city, their worlds collided. Their love story was not one of fairy tales. It was born in understanding, in the pain they both carried and the fire they both held. Justinian saw in her not just beauty, but intellect, strength, and something few men ever recognized in a woman: vision. He loved her not despite her past, but because of it. The court was scandalized. A future emperor with a former actress? It was unthinkable. But Justinian fought. He changed the law that forbade officials from marrying actresses. He defied tradition, society, and whispers in the halls of power. And when he married Theodora, she didn't just become his wife. She became his partner. In 527 AD, when Justinian was crowned emperor, Theodora stood beside him, not as a silent empress, but as a force. She didn't just wear the crown, she reshaped it. But power is never gifted without resistance. Theodora walked into a court that never wanted her. She sat at a throne surrounded by men who doubted her, mocked her, and feared her influence. And yet, she never flinched. She learned their language. She studied their laws. And slowly, she began to steer the empire's soul. She fought for women. She created laws that protected girls from exploitation, outlawed trafficking, and gave widows new rights. She turned her palace into a shelter for women escaping violence. For the first time in Byzantine history, the voice of a woman echoed, not in whispers, but in law. But Theodora's courage was never clearer than during the darkest days of Justinian's rule. In 532 AD, the Nika riots erupted in Constantinople. What began as a sporting rivalry turned into a rebellion. The city burned. Mobs stormed the palace. The emperor's advisors begged him to flee. Ships waited at the harbor. Escape was easy. But Theodora refused. In a room filled with trembling men, she stood, calm and unshaken. And with a voice that cut through fear, she said, "Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. Royalty is a fine burial shroud." She reminded Justinian of what they had fought for, of what they were building, and of who they were. Her words lit a fire in him and in the army. The rebellion was crushed, the city rebuilt, and Theodora's place in history forever sealed. But behind the power, Theodora remained a woman marked by pain. She could not bear children, and the sorrow of that loss never left her. She poured her love into the people of the empire. And though many never knew her story, they felt her strength in the laws, in the shelters, in the whispers of justice where once there had been silence. Years passed. Empires shifted, but Theodora stood by Justinian's side, not in his shadow, but in his light. To the world, she was an empress. To Justinian, a soul he trusted more than any general, any priest, any senator. And to history, she became something even greater. Proof that where you begin does not define where you can rise. Time moved on, and so did the challenges. The empire stretched wide, its foundations constantly shaking under the weight of war, religion, and rebellion. But while Justinian labored with armies and architects, Theodora quietly wove her influence through the soul of Byzantium. Her power didn't come from the sword. It came from the strength of thought, resolve, and relentless compassion that in the vast marble halls of the palace. She became more than an empress. She became a symbol. Officials feared her mind more than her husband's crown. Priests debated her beliefs, yet couldn't deny her commitment. Foreign ambassadors who expected to meet a silent, adorned woman found instead a fierce, articulate force. Theodora listened more than she spoke. But when she did speak, every word struck like lightning. She took particular interest in the cause of women. She knew what it meant to be vulnerable, to be used, to be dismissed. She remembered the cold eyes of men in power and the hollow echo of being unheard. That memory became her mission. She strengthened laws that protected young girls from being trafficked into brothels. She mandated that women had a right to own property, inherit wealth, and retain custody of their children after a husband's death. She gave abandoned women shelter, literal homes inside the palace grounds, turning stone walls into sanctuaries. Many mocked her efforts, saying women were not meant to influence the state. But Theodora knew what they feared wasn't a woman's weakness. It was her strength. Behind closed doors, she debated with bishops on matters of faith. Her embrace of Monophysitism, a branch of Christianity that believed in the single divine nature of Christ, set her at odds with the Orthodox Church. But she didn't yield. She funded churches and monasteries in secret, protected Monophysite clergy, and ensured their beliefs survived even when threatened by the very empire she ruled. This wasn't rebellion. It was quiet resistance, a silent war fought not with violence, but with conviction. Theodora and Justinian were not always aligned. They disagreed, sometimes bitterly. But that was their strength. They balanced each other. Where Justinian leaned toward law, Theodora leaned toward mercy. Where he saw systems, she saw people. And slowly, the empire began to reflect both visions. And yet, Theodora carried her past with her always. The nights of hunger, the years of humiliation, the faces of forgotten girls in the alleys of Constantinople, none of it ever left her. They became ghosts that lived within her. But instead of haunting her, they drove her. Many couldn't understand her determination. To the senators, she was too bold. To the clergy, too defiant. To the nobility, too common. But Theodora never tried to please. She didn't rise to be liked. She rose to be remembered. And she was as years passed. Her health began to decline. Whispers filled the palace. The woman who had stood through fires, riots, and rebellions was now quietly fading. But Theodora didn't cling to her power. She clung to her purpose. Even in her final days, she worked. She summoned architects to plan another refuge for women. She met secretly with bishops to ensure peace among her people. She drafted edicts with trembling hands. Her mind remained a fortress, even as her body weakened. Justinian watched the woman he had loved so fiercely, now becoming frail. But their bond, forged not in privilege but in struggle, only deepened. He would sit beside her, silent for hours, holding the hand that had once held empires. In 548 AD, Theodora died. She was only in her early 40s. Her death left a wound, not just in the palace, but in the soul of Byzantium. Justinian mourned. But more than that, he continued her work. Her memory guided him in law, in policy, and in heart. The Grand Hagia Sophia, which they had dreamed of together, stood as a symbol not just of faith, but of what could be built when two unlikely souls believe in something greater than themselves. But what truly defined Theodora wasn't her rise. It was what she did once she rose. She didn't forget where she came from. She didn't bury her past. She honored it, carried it like a badge, and used it to reshape the world around her. She reminded the empire that power doesn't only come from lineage, blood, or wealth. It comes from resilience, from a refusal to be silenced. History often forgets women like her. The chronicles of war and empire rarely leave space for stories of compassion, reform, and quiet revolution. But Theodora's legacy refused to fade. She lived in every girl who found protection in her loss, in every widow who found strength after loss, in every woman who dared to rise, not because she was allowed, but because she believed she could. Even centuries later, artists painted her in mosaics with piercing eyes, holding a chalice, standing like a queen, not because of the robe she wore, but because of the fire she carried. That fire had once flickered in a frightened girl on the stage, hiding behind painted smiles. And now, it burned in the annals of history. From dancer to empress, from courtesan to queen, Theodora proved that no path is too humble, no start too broken, and no soul too forgotten to shape the fate of an empire. Because she wasn't just the Empress of Byzantium. She was the Empress of possibility.